The blood seeped through Kathleen Jones's split lip as she crumpled to the ground, the late afternoon sun beating down on her bruised body. Her former employer, Walter Harrington, stood over her, his face contorted with rage and whiskey. She had dared to demand her rightful pay after 3 months of working at his general store, and this was his answer. "Let that be a lesson to you, girl," he spat, wiping his knuckles on his vest. "No woman tells me what to do." He kicked at the dirt near her face before stalking back into his store, leaving Kathleen broken and humiliated in the yard. Through swollen eyes, she could see townsfolk passing by, averting their gaze as if she were invisible. Nobody in Willow Creek dared cross Harrington, not with his money and connections. Pain radiated through her ribs as she tried to push herself up, only to collapse again onto the hard-packed earth. The sound of horse hooves approached, but Kathleen couldn't muster the strength to look up. She felt rather than saw a shadow fall across her battered form. "Good Lord," a deep voice murmured. Boots entered her limited field of vision, worn and dusty. Strong arms slipped beneath her, lifting her with surprising gentleness. Kathleen whimpered as her bruised ribs protested. "You're done there," the man said, his voice low and resolute as he cradled her against a broad chest that smelled of leather and open plains. "No one's gonna hurt you anymore." She managed to tilt her head back, catching sight of a strong jaw dusted with stubble, serious eyes the color of a summer storm, and a worn Stetson pulled low. He carried her toward a magnificent chestnut stallion waiting nearby. She tried to speak, but her split lip made it difficult. "Taking you to Doc Miller," he said firmly. "Name's Caleb Blackburn, madam, and whoever did this to you is going to answer for it." As consciousness slipped away from Kathleen, she had one final thought in Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878. Nobody had ever stood up for her before. When Kathleen next opened her eyes, she found herself in an unfamiliar room, lying on crisp sheets. Her body ached with every breath, but the immediate terror had subsided. Afternoon sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting intricate patterns across a modest but clean bedroom. "You're awake," came a gentle female voice. Kathleen turned her head slowly to see an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes watching her from a rocking chair. "Where am I?" Kathleen's voice was barely a whisper. "You're at my boarding house, dear. I'm Martha Simmons." The woman set aside her knitting and moved to Kathleen's bedside. "My nephew Caleb brought you here after Doc Miller tended to your injuries." Memory flooded back Harrington's rage, the beating, and then strong arms lifting her from the dirt. "The cowboy," she murmured. "Yes, Caleb found you outside Harrington's store." Martha's face tightened with disapproval. "That man has tormented this town long enough." "I worked for him," Kathleen explained, wincing as she tried to sit up. 3 months, and when I asked for my wages." She couldn't finish. Martha helped her settle against the pillows. "No need to explain, dear. Rest now. You're safe here." A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of the man who'd rescued her. Without his hat, Kathleen could see his full face, handsome in a weathered way, with intelligent gray eyes that assessed her condition quickly. "Miss Jones," he said with a nod. "Good to see you awake." "How do you know my name?" Kathleen asked. "Small town," he replied simply. "And I asked around after taking you to Doc's." Martha patted Kathleen's hand. "I'll bring up some broth. You need your strength." She left the room, giving Caleb a pointed look that Kathleen couldn't quite interpret. When they were alone, Caleb remained standing by the door, keeping a respectful distance. Doc says you've got 2 cracked ribs, plenty of bruising, but nothing that won't heal with time and rest." "Thank you, Mr. Blackburn," she said quietly. "I don't know how I'll repay your kindness." "No need." His jaw tightened. "What Harrington did, no decent man would stand by and allow it." "Yet many did," she observed, thinking of the townspeople who had walked past. "This town's been under Harrington's thumb too long." Caleb crossed his arms. "I've been away ranching up north for 6 years. Things have changed here, and not for the better." Kathleen studied him. "You're from Willow Creek originally?" He nodded. "Born and raised, just returned last month when my uncle passed, left me a small spread about 5 miles out." His expression softened slightly. "What about you, Miss Jones? You're not from around here." "I came from Boston last year after my parents died of influenza," she explained. "I had an aunt in Tucson, but she passed shortly after I arrived. I've been working my way through various towns since then." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "And Harrington hired you?" "3 months ago. Said I had a way with numbers. I kept his books." She looked down at her bruised hands. "When I asked for my wages, he claimed I'd been stealing. Then She couldn't continue. "I know what happened next," Caleb said quietly, "and I won't let him get away with it." Fear clutched at Kathleen's heart. "Please, Mr. Blackburn, don't trouble yourself further. Harrington has the sheriff in his pocket. You'll only bring problems on yourself." A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "I've never been one to shy away from trouble, Miss Jones, especially when it's the right kind of trouble." He moved toward the door. "Rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger." As he left, Kathleen sank back against the pillows, wondering what sort of man would stand against someone like Harrington for a woman he didn't even know. Over the next week, Kathleen slowly regained her strength. Martha proved to be a kind and attentive hostess, bringing nourishing meals and keeping her company during long afternoons. She learned that Martha had been widowed 15 years earlier, but had successfully run the boarding house alone since then. Of Caleb, she saw little. He appeared briefly each evening to inquire after her health, but never stayed long. From Martha, Kathleen learned he was busy with his ranch, the Circle B, but the older woman hinted there was more to his comings and goings than just ranch work. By the 8th day, Kathleen was able to move about the room without assistance. She stood at the window, watching the dusty main street of Willow Creek with its wooden sidewalks and hitching posts. From this vantage point, she could see Harrington's general store. The sight of it made her stomach clench with fear and anger. "You shouldn't be up so long," Martha chided, entering with a tray of tea. "I can't stay in bed forever," Kathleen replied, "or in this room. You've been so kind, Mrs. Simmons, but I've imposed on you enough." "Nonsense, and call me Martha, please." The older woman set down the tray. "Besides, where would you go? What would you do?" The questions hung in the air. Kathleen had exactly 73 cents to her name and no prospects. Without her wages from Harrington, she couldn't even afford a stage ticket to the next town. "I'll find something," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm educated. I can read, write, and do figures better than most." Martha studied her with shrewd eyes. "You know, Caleb mentioned he could use someone to help with the books at his ranch. He's got a small operation, but growing. 5 hands working for him now." Kathleen stiffened. "I couldn't accept charity, Martha." "It's not charity if you're working, girl," Martha countered, "and Caleb's not offering out of pity. He's a businessman, despite that cowboy exterior. He recognizes talent when he sees it." Before Kathleen could respond, They heard the front door open and close, followed by heavy footsteps on the stairs. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the feminine surroundings. "Ladies," he greeted them with a nod. His gaze lingered on Kathleen, noting her position by the window. "You're looking better, Miss Jones." "Thank you, Mr. Blackburn." She returned to her chair, not wanting to appear weak before him. "Your aunt was just mentioning that you might have some bookkeeping work." Caleb shot Martha a look that suggested this wasn't how he'd planned to approach the subject. "I do. Ranch accounts are a mess. I'm expanding the herd and need to keep better records." "And what would this position entail?" "Room and board at the ranch house, plus $15 a month." He stated it as a business proposition. "It's not much, but it's honest work." $15 a month was more than fair, and Kathleen knew it, but still she hesitated. "Mr. Blackburn, I appreciate the offer, but I wouldn't want to be alone at a ranch with men I don't know." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You wouldn't be. Mrs. Watkins, my housekeeper, lives in the main house. She's 60 if she's a day and carries a shotgun she's not afraid to use." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "And the hands stay in the bunkhouse, a good distance from the main house." Martha nodded approvingly. "Hannah Watkins is as proper a woman as you'll find, Kathleen. You'd be perfectly respectable there." Kathleen considered her options, which were admittedly few. "I would need to earn my own way, Mr. Blackburn. No special treatment." "Wouldn't think of it," he assured her. "In fact, I expect you to earn every penny. Those books are in terrible shape." Despite herself, Kathleen smiled slightly. "When would you like me to start?" "When Doc Miller says you're fit to travel to the ranch," Caleb said. "No rush. You heal first." As he spoke, a commotion erupted from the street below. They moved to the window to see Walter Harrington stumbling out of the saloon across the way, clearly drunk despite the early hour. He was shouting and gesturing wildly. "Where is she?" they heard him bellow. "Where's that thieving girl?" Kathleen instinctively stepped back from the window, her face paling. Caleb's expression darkened as he watched Harrington. "Has he been looking for me?" Kathleen asked quietly. Martha nodded grimly. "Started the day after Caleb brought you here. Claims you stole $50 from the till before he caught you." "That's a lie!" Kathleen's hands trembled with anger. "He refused to pay me 3 months' wages, nearly $75 he owes me." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I believe you." He watched as the sheriff approached Harrington, speaking to him quietly before leading him back toward the saloon. The exchange looked more friendly than official. "Sheriff Dawson won't help," Caleb said, more to himself than to the women. "Never does when it comes to Harrington." "Which is why you should both be careful," Martha warned. "Walter has too many friends in this town." Caleb turned from the window, his expression resolute. "Not as many as he thinks." He placed his hat back on his head. "I need to return to the ranch, but I'll be back tomorrow. Think on my offer, Miss Jones." After he left, Kathleen sat heavily in her chair. "Martha, what do you know of your nephew? He seems different from most men I've encountered." Martha smiled enigmatically. "Caleb always was a boy with a strong sense of justice. 6 years away working other men's ranches only strengthened that trait." She poured tea into delicate cups. "And he's stubborn as a mule once he sets his mind to something." "And what has he set his mind to now?" Kathleen asked. "That," Martha said, "is something you'll have to discover for yourself." 3 days later, Dr. Miller declared Kathleen well enough to travel to the Circle B ranch. Her ribs still ached, and fading yellow bruises marked her face, but she could move without wincing with every breath. Caleb arrived mid-morning with a wagon rather than his horse, the back filled with straw and blankets to make the journey more comfortable. Martha packed a basket of food and fussed over Kathleen like a mother hen, making sure she had everything she needed. "You come visit me when you're up to it," Martha insisted, embracing her gently. "And don't let that nephew of mine work you too hard." Kathleen hugged her back, surprising herself with the depth of affection she felt for this woman she'd known such a short time. "Thank you for everything, Martha." Caleb helped her into the wagon with careful hands, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the boarding house, Kathleen felt both relief and apprehension. She was leaving the town where she'd been humiliated, but heading into an unknown future. They traveled in companionable silence for a time, the wagon jolting occasionally over ruts in the road. Kathleen watched the town recede and the landscape open up around them, rolling grasslands dotted with scrub, distant mountains hazy on the horizon. "I've never seen such open space," she remarked. Caleb glanced at her. "Different from Boston, I imagine." "Very. Everything there feels contained. Here, it's endless." She breathed deeply, wincing slightly as her ribs protested. "It's beautiful in a wild sort of way." "That it is," Caleb agreed, his eyes scanning the landscape with obvious affection. "Takes a certain kind of person to love it, though. Some find it too harsh, too unforgiving." "And you?" she asked. A rare smile crossed his face. "Couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Tried it for 6 years, working ranches up in Montana and Wyoming. Good land up there, but it wasn't home." As they rounded a bend in the road, Kathleen spotted a rider approaching fast. Caleb tensed beside her, his hand moving subtly toward his hip where, she now noticed, a revolver was holstered. The rider slowed as he approached, revealing himself to be a young man, perhaps 17, with an anxious expression. "Mr. Blackburn," he called, reining his horse alongside the wagon. "Thank goodness I caught you." "What is it, Billy?" Caleb asked, his voice calm but alert. "It's Jenkins, sir. 3 men rode onto the property about an hour after you left. Said they were looking to buy cattle, but Jenkins didn't recognize them. They were asking questions about you, and—" his eyes flicked to Kathleen. "A woman you might have with you." Caleb's expression hardened. "Did they give names?" "No, sir, but one had a star on his vest, not a proper sheriff's badge, just a star." "Deputy Hollis," Caleb muttered, "one of Dawson's men." He looked at Kathleen. Harrington's still causing trouble. Fear twisted in her stomach. Perhaps I should return to town. "No," Caleb said firmly. "That's exactly what they want." He turned back to Billy. "Ride back and tell Jenkins to have the men ready. Nothing obvious, but I want eyes watching the property." "Yes, sir." Billy hesitated. "Jenkins also said to tell you that Mr. Montgomery arrived early. He's waiting at the house." Caleb nodded. "Thank you, Billy. Now go and be careful." As the young man galloped away, Kathleen looked questioningly at Caleb. "Who's Mr. Montgomery?" "Banker from Phoenix," Caleb replied, flicking the reins to urge the horses to a faster pace. "I'm seeking a loan to expand the herd." But something in his tone made Kathleen think there was more to the story. "And these men asking questions about me?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Harrington's not one to let things go, especially his pride." He glanced at her. "Don't worry, Miss Jones. My ranch is well protected." They traveled the rest of the journey in tense silence. When they finally crested a small hill, Kathleen got her first view of the Circle B. It was modest compared to some of the grand ranches she'd heard about, but impressive nonetheless. A large main house of weathered wood with a wide porch dominated the property. Behind it stood a barn, corral, and what she assumed was the bunkhouse. Several smaller outbuildings were scattered about, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Pride flickered across Caleb's face. "It's small, but growing. My uncle started with just 20 head of cattle. Now we're up to nearly 300. With Montgomery's loan, I'm hoping to double that by next year." As they approached the main house, Kathleen noticed a well-dressed man waiting on the porch, along with an older woman who must be Mrs. Watkins. 3 ranch hands were visible near the corral, all watching their arrival with interest. Caleb helped Kathleen down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, which she quickly dismissed as a reaction to her still healing injuries. "Mr. Montgomery," Caleb called, guiding Kathleen toward the porch. "Thank you for making the journey." The banker stepped forward, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and calculating eyes. "Mr. Blackburn, I was beginning to think you'd forgotten our appointment." "Unavoidable delay," Caleb replied smoothly. "May I present Miss Kathleen Jones, my new bookkeeper. Miss Jones, this is Harold Montgomery of the First National Bank of Phoenix." Montgomery assessed Kathleen with sharp eyes, taking in her fading bruises with a flicker of surprise. "Miss Jones," he acknowledged with a nod. "A bookkeeper, you say? Interesting choice for a ranch." "Miss Jones has excellent skills with figures," Caleb said. "I believe in investing in the future of this ranch, Mr. Montgomery, and proper financial management is part of that." The banker seemed to approve of this answer. "Indeed. Well, shall we discuss business?" "After Miss Jones has been settled," Caleb said firmly. "Mrs. Watkins, would you show Miss Jones to her room and help her get acquainted with the house?" The housekeeper, a sturdy woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, stepped forward. "Of course, Mr. Blackburn." To Kathleen she added, "Come along, dear. You look like you could use some rest after your journey." As Kathleen followed Mrs. Watkins into the house, she heard Montgomery say quietly to Caleb, "Is she the woman Harrington's been making a fuss about in town?" She didn't hear Caleb's response as the door closed behind them, cutting off the conversation. The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable, with solid, well-made furniture and touches that spoke of a woman's influence, likely Martha's, Kathleen surmised, or perhaps Caleb's mother before her passing. Mrs. Watkins led her to a pleasant room at the back of the house, overlooking a small kitchen garden. "This will be your room, Miss Jones. Bathrooms down the hall. We have indoor plumbing, which Mr. Blackburn's uncle installed last year. Quite the modern convenience." "It's lovely," Kathleen said, taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings, a bed with a colorful quilt, a small writing desk by the window, a dresser, and a rocking chair in the corner. "Dinner's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Watkins continued. "Mr. Blackburn takes breakfast at dawn, but I can save you a plate if you prefer to sleep later." "I'll be up for breakfast," Kathleen assured her. "I'm eager to begin work." Mrs. Watkins studied her with shrewd eyes. "Mr. Blackburn said you were recovering from an incident." Kathleen touched her bruised cheek self-consciously. "Yes, but I'm well enough to work." The older woman nodded approvingly. "Good. Can't abide idleness myself." She moved toward the door. "Rest now if you need it. I'll call you for dinner." Left alone, Kathleen unpacked her few belongings, then sat at the desk and looked out at the vast landscape. From this window, she could see rolling grasslands stretching to distant mountains. The openness of it stirred something in her, a sense of possibility she hadn't felt since before her parents' deaths. She was startled from her thoughts by a knock at the door. When she opened it, Caleb stood there, his expression unreadable. "May I speak with you a moment, Miss Jones?" "Of course," she replied, stepping back to allow him into the room, though she left the door open for propriety's sake. Caleb removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Mr. Montgomery has approved the loan," he said without preamble. "But he also brought news from town. Harrington has filed a formal complaint against you for theft." Kathleen's heart sank. "But I didn't steal anything." "I know that," Caleb assured her, "but Sheriff Dawson has issued a warrant for your arrest. Montgomery said he overheard them planning to ride out here tomorrow to serve it." Fear clutched at her. "What will happen to me?" Caleb's expression was grim. "If they take you back to town, Harrington will make sure you're convicted. His influence runs deep." "Then I should leave," she said, her mind racing. "I could take the stage from the next town." "No," Caleb interrupted. "That's exactly what he wants to run you off, to win. There's another way." He met her eyes directly. "Montgomery is not just a banker. He's also a federal marshal here investigating corruption in several territorial towns, including Willow Creek." Kathleen stared at him, stunned. "A federal marshal? And you knew this?" Caleb nodded. "I've been corresponding with him for months. My time away from Willow Creek gave me perspective on how Harrington and his allies have corrupted this town. When I returned and saw how bad things had become, I reached out to the federal authorities. And what does this mean for me?" "It means we have a powerful ally," Caleb explained. "Montgomery wants to build a case against Harrington and Sheriff Dawson. Your situation could be key evidence if you're willing to help." Kathleen considered this. Part of her wanted nothing more than to flee, to put Willow Creek and Walter Harrington far behind her. But another part, a stronger part, burned with the injustice of it all. "What would I need to do?" she asked. Relief flickered across Caleb's face. "Stay here where it's safe. When Dawson and his men arrive tomorrow, Montgomery will be waiting. He'll reveal his true identity and prevent them from taking you. He needs to witness their corruption firsthand." "Using me as bait," Kathleen observed. "I won't let any harm come to you," Caleb said with such conviction that she found herself believing him. "Montgomery has deputies positioned nearby, and my men are loyal." Kathleen took a deep breath. "Very well, Mr. Blackburn. I'll help." A rare smile touched his lips. "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "And perhaps, given our circumstances, you might call me Caleb." She found herself returning his smile. "Then I'm Kathleen." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Kathleen had slept surprisingly well despite the tension of their situation. She dressed in one of the 2 serviceable dresses she owned and made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Watkins was already preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Jones," the housekeeper greeted her. "Mr. Blackburn is in his study with Mr. Montgomery. They asked not to be disturbed until breakfast." Kathleen nodded, understanding they were likely finalizing plans for the confrontation to come. "May I help with anything?" Mrs. Watkins assessed her, then gestured to a bowl of eggs. "You can scramble those if your hands are steady." As Kathleen worked alongside the older woman, she asked carefully, "Mrs. Watkins, do you know about Mr. Montgomery's true purpose here?" The housekeeper's lips thinned. "I do. Worked for the Blackburn family for 20 years, miss. I know when something's afoot." She lowered her voice. This town's needed cleaning up for a long while. Harrington's had his boot on too many necks. Including yours? Kathleen ventured. Mrs. Watkins paused in her biscuit-making. My son owns the livery in town. 2 years ago, Harrington decided he wanted the land it sits on. When my boy refused to sell, accidents started happening. Fires, spooked horses, customers threatened. Sheriff did nothing. Her hands resumed their work with renewed vigor. My boy nearly lost everything before Mr. Caleb returned and helped him stand his ground. Kathleen understood better now Caleb's determination to see justice done. It wasn't just about her, it was about an entire town suffering under corruption. Footsteps approaching the kitchen announced the arrival of Caleb and Montgomery. Both men looked serious but determined. "Good morning, ladies," Montgomery said politely. Caleb's eyes found Kathleen's immediately. "How are you feeling today?" "Ready," she replied simply. They ate breakfast with little conversation, the tension in the air palpable. After the meal, Montgomery excused himself to prepare, which Kathleen understood to mean positioning his deputies. Caleb led her to the study, a comfortable room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk covered in papers. "These are the books I mentioned," he said, gesturing to several leather-bound ledgers. "My uncle was meticulous until his eyesight began failing about 2 years ago. Since then, it's been chaos." Kathleen examined the most recent ledger, quickly identifying discrepancies and haphazard entries. "I can certainly bring order to this," she said, "though it may take some time." "Time is something we have," Caleb replied. He moved to the window, his posture alert. "They're coming, earlier than expected." Kathleen joined him at the window. In the distance, a cloud of dust signaled approaching riders. Her heart began to race. "Stay calm," Caleb said quietly. "Remember, they have no real authority here. Montgomery won't let them take you." He guided her back to the desk. "Sit. Look as though you're working. I want them to see you're employed here legitimately." Kathleen sat, opening the ledger and picking up a pencil with hands. She fought to keep steady. Caleb moved to the doorway. "I'll be right outside," he promised. "Montgomery is positioning himself in the parlor, out of sight initially." Soon, they heard the thunder of hooves approaching the house, followed by men's voices calling out. Kathleen forced herself to keep her eyes on the ledger, though her attention was entirely focused on the sounds outside. Through the open study door, she heard Caleb step onto the porch. "Sheriff Dawson," he called, "what brings you out to the Circle B?" "You know damn well why we're here, Blackburn," came a gruff reply. "We've got a warrant for that thieving woman you're harboring." "Miss Jones is employed by me as my bookkeeper," Caleb replied evenly. "She's committed no crime." "That's not what Harrington says," another voice interjected. Deputy Hollis, Kathleen guessed, "says she stole $50 from his till before he caught her." "A convenient accusation from a man who refused to pay her 3 months' wages," Caleb countered. "That's between them," Dawson said dismissively. "We've got a warrant, and we're taking her back to town." "I'm afraid I can't allow that," Caleb stated firmly. There was a dangerous pause, then the sound of guns being drawn. Kathleen's breath caught in her throat. "You're interfering with the law, Blackburn," Dawson growled. "That's a dangerous game." "Is it the law, Sheriff?" A new voice entered the conversation, Montgomery's, calm and authoritative. "Or is it Harrington's bidding you're doing?" "Who the hell are you?" Dawson demanded. "Harold Montgomery, federal marshal." The sound of a badge being displayed. "I'm investigating corruption in territorial law enforcement, with particular interest in Willow Creek." Silence fell. heavy with shock and sudden fear. "Now," Montgomery continued, "I suggest you lower those weapons before my deputies, currently positioned around this property. Decide you're a threat." As if on cue, several men emerged from various points of cover, rifles trained on the sheriff and his deputies. Kathleen couldn't resist moving to the window. She saw Sheriff Dawson, a heavyset man with a florid face, looking stunned and increasingly angry. Beside him, Deputy Hollis and another man she didn't recognize shifted nervously in their saddles. "This is federal overreach," Dawson blustered. "We've got legitimate business here." "Do you?" Montgomery countered. "Because from where I stand, it looks like harassment based on dubious accusations from a prominent citizen who seems to have unusual influence over local law enforcement." Caleb's voice was cold with controlled anger. "How much did Harrington pay you to come after Miss Jones, Sheriff?" Dawson's face reddened further. "You're treading on thin ice, Blackburn." "No," Montgomery interjected. "You are, Sheriff. I've been building a case for months. Miss Jones's situation is merely the latest in a pattern. Now, you have two choices: leave peacefully and prepare to cooperate with my investigation, or resist and face immediate arrest for obstruction of justice." For a tense moment, Kathleen thought Dawson might choose the latter. His hand hovered near his holster, his face contorted with rage and fear. But finally, he spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he warned, turning his horse sharply. His deputies followed suit, and the three men galloped away from the ranch, dust billowing in their wake. Kathleen sagged against the window frame with relief. Outside, Caleb and Montgomery exchanged words she couldn't hear. Then Caleb turned toward the house. Their eyes met through the window, and something passed between them, an understanding, a shared victory. That evening, after Montgomery had departed with promises to return soon with more federal agents, Kathleen sat on the porch with Caleb, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Montgomery will build his case, with testimonies from you, from others Harrington has wronged. From my men who witnessed today's events, it should be enough to bring charges against both Harrington and Dawson. And in the meantime," Caleb said, turning to face her, "those books won't organize themselves." Kathleen smiled. "No, they certainly won't." For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt something like hope. Not just for justice, but for the possibility of building something new here, something honest and good. The weeks that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Each morning, Kathleen rose early and joined Caleb for breakfast before he headed out to work with the cattle. She spent her days in the study, meticulously organizing the ranch's accounts, creating systems for tracking expenses and income, and occasionally riding with Caleb to neighboring ranches where he introduced her as his bookkeeper with evident pride. True to his word, Montgomery returned after 2 weeks with additional federal agents. They established a temporary office in the nearby town of Copper Springs, bypassing Willow Creek's corrupt infrastructure entirely. One by one, they interviewed townsfolk who had suffered under Harrington's influence, merchants forced to pay protection fees, homesteaders driven off valuable land, women harassed without consequence. Kathleen provided her own detailed statement, documenting Harrington's refusal to pay her wages and the subsequent beating. The memory still brought shame and anger, but the act of providing testimony of being believed was surprisingly healing. As spring warmed into summer, the Circle B flourished. Caleb's expanded herd thrived on the rich grasslands, and the new calves born that season promised future prosperity. Kathleen found unexpected satisfaction in bringing order to the ranch's finances, identifying opportunities for savings and growth that Caleb implemented with appreciation for her insights. But it was their evenings together that she came to treasure most. After dinner, they would often sit on the porch, watching the sunset while discussing books, sharing stories of their vastly different upbringings, or simply enjoying comfortable silence. Sometimes he would read aloud from one of the classics in his uncle's library, his deep voice bringing the words to life in a way that made Kathleen's heart beat a little faster. She tried to ignore the growing warmth she felt in his presence, the way her pulse quickened when their hands accidentally touched, or how she found herself watching him when he was unaware, admiring the strength in his shoulders as he chopped wood or the gentleness with which he treated the horses. For his part, Caleb remained respectful and proper, never crossing the boundaries of their professional relationship. Yet sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an expression that suggested he might be fighting the same battle she was, propriety versus growing affection. One evening in late June, they sat on the porch after a particularly hot day, enjoying the cooling breeze. Mrs. Watkins had retired early, leaving them alone with the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "Montgomery believes they'll have enough evidence to make arrests by the end of the month," Caleb said, breaking a comfortable silence. Kathleen nodded, both relieved and apprehensive. "That's good news." "You don't sound entirely convinced." She sighed, trying to articulate her mixed feelings. "I want justice, I do. But the idea of facing Harrington again, of reliving that day in court—" "You're brave enough to do it," Caleb said with quiet certainty. Kathleen looked at him, surprised by his confidence. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've watched you these past weeks," he replied simply. "You've faced every challenge with dignity and determination. You rebuilt your life when it would have been easier to run. That takes courage." His words touched something deep within her. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb leaned forward, his expression earnest in the fading light. "Kathleen, when this is all over, when Harrington and Dawson have faced justice, what will you do?" The question caught her off guard. She had been so focused on the present that she hadn't allowed herself to think too far ahead. I don't know. Continue working here if you'll have me." "Is that what you want?" he pressed gently. "Yes," she admitted. "I've found peace here, purpose." Caleb seemed to be weighing his next words carefully. "And is that all you want? Just to work here?" The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Kathleen's heart raced as she realized what he might be asking. Before she could respond, however, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. They both stood, instantly alert. Visitors at this hour could not be bringing good news. Two riders appeared in the yard, their forms barely visible in the gathering dusk. Caleb stepped protectively in front of Kathleen, his hand moving to his holster. "Who's there?" he called sharply. "Marshal Montgomery," came the reply, "and Deputy Lewis." Caleb relaxed slightly but remained wary until the riders came close enough to confirm their identities. Once recognized, the men dismounted and approached the porch with grim expressions. "What's happened?" Caleb asked. Montgomery removed his hat, his face grave in the lamplight spilling from the house. "Harrington somehow got wind of our plans. He's fled Willow Creek, taking as much cash as he could gather from his store and the bank." "When?" Caleb demanded. "Sometime last night." We only discovered it this afternoon when we went to serve the arrest warrant. Montgomery's expression darkened further. That's not all. Before he left, he torched several businesses that had provided testimony against him: the livery, the newspaper office, the milliner's shop. Kathleen gasped. Was anyone hurt? Thankfully, no, but the damage is extensive. Caleb's jaw tightened with anger. And Dawson? In custody, Montgomery assured him. He claims no knowledge of Harrington's plans, but we found evidence in his office suggesting otherwise. What about Harrington? Kathleen asked. Do you know where he went? Montgomery shook his head. We've sent telegrams to neighboring towns and alerted law enforcement throughout the territory. He won't get far with a federal warrant on his head. But something in the marshal's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of that. Harrington had money and connections, two powerful advantages for a man on the run. I'd like you both to be vigilant, Montgomery continued. There's a chance Harrington might seek retribution against those he blames for his downfall. Kathleen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. You think he might come here? It's unlikely, Montgomery said, though not with complete conviction. But possible. He's desperate and angry, a dangerous combination. After the marshal and his deputy departed, promising to check in regularly, Kathleen and Caleb returned to the porch. The peaceful mood of earlier had evaporated, replaced by a tense alertness. Perhaps I should go, Kathleen said quietly. My presence here puts you and your ranch at risk. Caleb turned to her, his expression fierce. Absolutely not. This is exactly what Harrington wants: to keep people afraid, to keep them running. He took her hands in his, a gesture so unexpected that she didn't think to pull away. I won't let him win, not with the town, and certainly not with you. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. Caleb, I meant what I was trying to say before we were interrupted, he continued. I want you to stay at the Circle B, not just as my bookkeeper, but... He hesitated, then pressed on with determination. I care for you, Kathleen. More than I should, perhaps, given our circumstances. But these weeks with you have shown me what kind of woman you are: strong, intelligent, kind. The kind of woman I could build a life with, if you felt the same. Kathleen stared at him, her heart pounding. This declaration was everything she had secretly hoped for, but hadn't dared acknowledge. I do, she whispered. I care for you too, Caleb. But with Harrington still out there, with everything unresolved. Life doesn't wait for perfect circumstances, he said gently. If it did, most folks would never find happiness at all. His thumbs traced soft circles on her palms. I'm not asking for promises now. Just the chance to court you properly when this is all over, to see if what we both feel could grow into something lasting. Kathleen found herself nodding, a cautious joy blooming in her chest despite the shadow of Harrington's threat. Yes, she said. I'd like that very much. For a brief moment, it seemed Caleb might kiss her. Instead, he brought her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gentleman's gesture that somehow felt more intimate than a more forward advance would have. Then we have something worth fighting for, he said with quiet certainty. And no man, least of all Walter Harrington, is going to take that from us. Over the next several days, Caleb increased security at the ranch. The hands took turns keeping watch at night, and Kathleen noticed he kept his rifle closer at hand. Montgomery visited twice more, bringing news of the search for Harrington, but the fugitive remained elusive. Life at the Circle B continued, though with an undercurrent of vigilance. Caleb and Kathleen maintained their professional relationship during working hours, but in the evenings, they allowed themselves to explore their growing feelings through conversation and small gestures, his hand lingering on hers when passing a book, her fingers straightening his collar before he left for town, shared smiles across the dinner table that Mrs. Watkins pretended not to notice. A week after Harrington's disappearance, Caleb needed to travel to Copper Springs for a meeting with cattle buyers. He was reluctant to leave given the circumstances, but the sale was too important to the ranch's future to postpone. "I'll return by nightfall," he promised Kathleen as he prepared to leave. "Jenkins and the men have strict instructions not to leave the property unguarded, and Mrs. Watkins has her shotgun at the ready." "We'll be fine," Kathleen assured him, though she couldn't quite suppress a flicker of unease. The marshal said Harrington was likely headed for Mexico or California. Caleb's expression remained serious. "Even so, stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone, not even to the barn or corral." She nodded her agreement, touched by his concern. After he departed, Kathleen threw herself into her work, reviewing the prospective cattle sale figures one final time to ensure everything was in order. The day passed quietly, with Mrs. Watkins bustling about her usual tasks and ranch hands visible through the study window as they moved between the barn and pastures. By late afternoon, Kathleen had finished her work and found herself growing restless. The house felt stifling after hours at the desk, and she longed for fresh air. Remembering Caleb's warning, she sought out Mrs. Watkins. "I thought I might sit on the back porch for a while," she said. "The study's become rather warm." Mrs. Watkins looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. "That's fine, dear. Jenkins is working in the garden not 20 yards away. I'll bring you some lemonade shortly." The back porch offered a pleasant view of Mrs. Watkins's kitchen garden, and beyond it, the rolling grasslands that comprised most of the Circle B's grazing land. Kathleen settled into a rocking chair with a book, though she found herself more inclined to watch Jenkins working among the vegetable rows and enjoy the late afternoon breeze. She'd been there perhaps 15 minutes when she noticed a lone rider approaching from the east, a direction that didn't lead to town or any neighboring ranches. Something about the rider's posture set alarm bells ringing in her mind even before she could make out his features. When the rider drew close enough for recognition, Kathleen's blood ran cold. Walter Harrington, his face leaner and harder than she remembered, his eyes fixed on the ranch house with malevolent intent. Kathleen froze momentarily, then sprang to her feet. "Jenkins!" she called to the ranch hand. "Rider approaching from the east." Jenkins straightened, shading his eyes to look where she indicated. His body language shifted immediately to alertness as he recognized the threat. He moved toward Kathleen with purpose. "Get inside, Miss Jones," he ordered, drawing his sidearm. "Tell Mrs. Watkins to sound the alarm." Kathleen hurried into the house, finding Mrs. Watkins already moving toward the back door, alerted by the commotion. "It's Harrington," Kathleen explained breathlessly. "Jenkins says to sound the alarm." Without hesitation, Mrs. Watkins moved to the wall where a bell rope hung. She pulled it 3 times in quick succession, sending the clanging sound of the ranch bell echoing across the property, the predetermined signal for danger. "Stay away from the windows," the older woman instructed, moving to a cabinet from which she extracted a shotgun with practiced ease. "The men will handle this." But Kathleen couldn't bring herself to hide. She moved carefully to a side window that offered a view of the approaching confrontation. Jenkins had been joined by 2 other hands, all 3 men positioned protectively between Harrington and the house. "That's far enough, Harrington," Jenkins called, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "You're not welcome here." Harrington reined his horse to a stop about 30 yards from the men. Even at this distance, Kathleen could see the cold fury in his expression. "I'm not here for you, cowboy," Harrington called back. "I want the girl. She cost me everything, and she's going to pay." "Miss Jones is under Mr. Blackburn's protection," Jenkins replied steadily. "And he's not the kind of man who takes kindly to threats against those under his roof." Harrington's laugh was harsh and brittle. "Blackburn's not here, is he? Saw him headed toward Copper Springs myself." His hand moved to his holster. "Now, you boys can step aside and let me settle my business with the thieving girl, or you can die for another man's woman. Your choice." Jenkins didn't waver. "We're not moving, Harrington, and Mr. Blackburn will be back any minute." Harrington's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation, 3 armed men standing against him, the likelihood of more hands responding to the alarm bell. For a moment, it seemed he might reconsider. Then, with frightening suddenness, he drew his gun and fired. Jenkins grunted and staggered, clutching his shoulder, but managed to return fire along with the other hands. Harrington's horse reared as bullets kicked up dirt around it. He wheeled the animal around, firing wildly as he retreated toward a stand of trees at the edge of the property. "He's heading for the East Creek bed," one of the hands shouted. "We can cut him off at the ridge." The uninjured hands sprinted for the corral where their horses were kept, while Jenkins staggered toward the house, blood seeping between the fingers pressed to his wounded shoulder. Mrs. Watkins rushed to the door, shotgun still in hand. "Get him inside," she called to Kathleen. "I'll keep watch." Kathleen hurried to help Jenkins into the kitchen, where she eased him into a chair. "Where's the medical kit?" she asked Mrs. Watkins, who had positioned herself at the door. "Pantry shelf, blue box," the older woman replied without taking her eyes off the yard. "Bullet went clean through his shoulder by the looks of it." Kathleen found the kit and set to work cleaning and bandaging Jenkins's wound. The ranch hand gritted his teeth against the pain but remained conscious and alert. "Did they get him?" he asked Mrs. Watkins. "Don't know yet," she replied. "Thompson and Riley are in pursuit. Others are securing the perimeter." The next hour passed in tense vigilance. Mrs. Watkins insisted Kathleen stay away from windows and doors while she maintained her position at the kitchen entrance, shotgun ready. Outside, they could hear the ranch hands calling to each other as they searched the property and secured the livestock. The sound of approaching horses finally broke the tension. Mrs. Watkins peered cautiously through the window, then relaxed visibly. "It's Mr. Blackburn," she announced, "and Marshal Montgomery." Relief flooded through Kathleen. She moved to the door despite Mrs. Watkins's protests, needing to see for herself that Caleb was safe. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face tight with worry as he strode toward the house. When he saw Kathleen in the doorway, something in his expression broke open relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "You're all right," he said, reaching her in 3 long strides and taking her by the shoulders as if to reassure himself of her solid presence. "When we met Thompson on the road and he told us what happened." "I'm fine," she assured him. "Jenkins was shot, but the bullet went through clean. He'll recover." Montgomery approached, his expression grim. "And Harrington?" "The men were pursuing him toward the East Ridge," Mrs. Watkins supplied from the doorway. "We haven't heard anything since." Caleb's hands tightened briefly on Kathleen's shoulders before he released her. "I need to join the search. Montgomery, would you stay with the ladies?" "Of course," the marshal nodded. "But Caleb, remember we want him alive if possible. He needs to stand trial. Something dangerous flickered in Caleb's eyes, but he nodded curtly before returning to his horse and galloping toward the eastern part of the property. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit throughout the ranch yard, creating pools of light against the deepening shadows. Kathleen found herself unable to sit still, pacing between the kitchen where Jenkins rested and the front window where she strained to see any sign of the returning search party. "He'll be all right," Montgomery assured her, watching her anxious movements with understanding. "Caleb Blackburn can handle himself." "It's not just that," Kathleen admitted. "Harrington came here because of me. If Jenkins had been killed, or if any of the other men are hurt." "Harrington came here because he's a coward and a bully who can't accept consequences for his actions," Montgomery corrected firmly. "None of this is your fault, Miss Jones." Before she could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention. Kathleen hurried to the window, her heart in her throat. In the yard, several riders appeared in the lantern light. Caleb was at the front, his expression hard but unharmed. Behind him, two ranch hands flanked a slumped figure on horseback Harrington, his hands bound, his head bowed in defeat. "They got him," Kathleen breathed, relief washing through her. Montgomery moved to the door. "Stay inside," he instructed before stepping out to meet the returning party. Kathleen watched through the window as Caleb dismounted and spoke briefly with Montgomery, gesturing occasionally toward their prisoner. She couldn't hear their words, but the tension in Caleb's body was evident even at a distance. After several minutes of conversation, Montgomery approached Harrington and officially placed him under arrest, reciting charges that made the man's shoulders slump further. Two of Montgomery's deputies, who must have arrived while the search was underway, took custody of the prisoner. Only when Harrington had been led away did Caleb finally turn toward the house. His eyes found Kathleen at the window, and the hardness in his expression softened. He said something to Montgomery, who nodded, then strode purposefully toward the house. Kathleen met him at the door, propriety forgotten in her relief at seeing him safe. "Thank God you're unharmed," she said. Caleb's eyes searched her face. "Are you truly all right?" He never got near me," she assured him. "Jenkins and the others prevented that." The tension in his shoulders eased somewhat. "Good men. Jenkins's injury. Painful, but not life-threatening. Mrs. Watkins is tending to him." Caleb nodded, then surprised her by taking her hand and leading her to the porch, away from the bustle inside. In the privacy of the gathering darkness, he finally allowed his carefully maintained control to slip. "When Thompson told us Harrington had attacked the ranch, that he was looking for you specifically." His voice was rough with emotion. "I've never known fear like that, Kathleen. The thought of him hurting you, of losing you before I even had the chance to—" He broke off, seeming to struggle for words. Kathleen placed her hand against his cheek, a gesture of comfort that became something more when he leaned into her touch. "You didn't lose me," she said softly. "I'm right here." Something in her words or touch broke the last of his restraint. Caleb pulled her gently to him, one hand at the small of her back, the other cradling her face with surprising tenderness. "May I?" he whispered, his intent clear in his eyes. In answer, Kathleen rose slightly on her toes, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that began cautiously, almost reverently, before deepening with shared emotion relief, longing, and the promise of feelings too new and precious to name. When they finally parted, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "I've wanted to do that since the moment you started arguing with me about cattle prices," he confessed. Kathleen laughed softly, remembering their first spirited disagreement over the ranch ledgers. "That long?" "Longer, if I'm honest." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "But a gentleman doesn't kiss a lady senseless upon their first acquaintance." "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darkened. "Now I find myself struggling to remember why I thought waiting was such a virtue." Before he could demonstrate this point, the sound of boots on the porch steps reminded them they were not truly alone. They separated reluctantly as Montgomery approached. "Apologies for the interruption," the marshal said, though his knowing smile suggested he wasn't entirely sorry. "I thought you'd want to know Harrington has been secured. My deputies will transport him to Phoenix tomorrow for arraignment." Caleb's arm remained around Kathleen's waist, a public declaration of sorts that brought a flush to her cheeks, but no impulse to move away. "Will you need Kathleen to testify?" Caleb asked. "Eventually, yes," Montgomery confirmed, "but not immediately. The charges of attempted murder against your men are enough to hold him while we build the larger case." His expression softened slightly. "It's over, Miss Jones. He can't hurt you anymore." The words washed over her like a cleansing rain, dissolving a tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. It was over. Harrington would face justice, and she was free not just from his threats, but from the shame and fear that had shadowed her since that day in the yard. "Thank you, Marshal," she said sincerely, "for everything you've done." Montgomery tipped his hat. "Just doing my job, madam, though I admit this particular case has been especially satisfying." He glanced between them, his smile widening. "I'll leave you two to your discussion. Good night." As the marshal walked away, Kathleen turned back to Caleb. In the soft glow of the porch lantern, his face was open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "It truly is over," she said wonderingly. "We can finally look forward instead of over our shoulders." Caleb took both her hands in his. "And what do you see, Kathleen, when you look forward?" She considered the question carefully, understanding its significance. "I see this land, this ranch. I see the books balanced and the herds growing." Her voice softened. "I see evenings on this porch, watching the sunset. I see us." The last word was barely audible, but Caleb heard it. His grip on her hands tightened. "I see the same," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And more. I see years, Kathleen. A lifetime." He hesitated, then continued with determination. "I know it's soon, too soon, perhaps, by society's standards, but I've never been one to let convention dictate my heart. When you know, you know." Kathleen's pulse quickened. "Know what, Caleb?" "That you're the woman I want to build my life with." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "I'm not asking now, not officially. You deserve a proper courtship, time to be sure of your own heart. But I want you to know where mine stands." Tears pricked at Kathleen's eyes, not from sadness, but from a joy so intense it was almost painful. "I don't need time," she whispered. "My heart is already certain." The smile that broke across Caleb's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He pulled her close again, his kiss deeper now, a promise sealed with passion and tenderness combined. When they parted, both breathless, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. "Well then, Miss Jones, it seems we have a future to plan." 3 months later, on a crisp autumn day with leaves turning gold on the cottonwoods along the creek, Kathleen Jones became Kathleen Blackburn in a ceremony performed on the porch of the Circle B ranch house. Martha Simmons wept openly, while Mrs. Watkins pretended the tears in her eyes were merely from the wind. Marshall Montgomery, now a trusted friend, stood as Caleb's best man. The trial of Walter Harrington and former Sheriff Dawson had concluded the week before, resulting in lengthy prison sentences for both men. With their influence removed, Willow Creek was slowly healing, rebuilding the businesses Harrington had destroyed and establishing a new, honest town council. After the simple ceremony and celebration, when the guests had departed and dusk was settling over the land, Caleb led his bride to their favorite spot on the porch. They sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to communicate their deepest feelings. "Happy?" Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders. Kathleen leaned into him, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Completely." She placed her hand over his heart. "When you found me that day in the yard, I had nothing. No hope, no future, just pain and humiliation." "You had strength," Caleb corrected gently, "and courage. I just helped you find your feet again." "You did far more than that," she said. "You lifted me up in every way a person can be lifted. You gave me sanctuary when I needed it most, respect when others offered only judgment, and love when I'd forgotten such a thing was possible." Caleb turned to her, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. "And you gave me purpose beyond this land, beyond cattle and ledgers. You showed me what partnership truly means in work, in conviction, in building something lasting." He kissed her then. A kiss that spoke of promises kept and those yet to be fulfilled, of children who would one day run across these grasslands, of battles they would fight together for justice and what was right, of quiet evenings like this one, stretching into decades of shared contentment. As night settled fully over the Circle B, Caleb stood and offered his hand to his wife. "Shall we go in, Mrs. Blackburn?" Kathleen placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and tenderness in his grip, the same hands that had lifted her from the dirt all those months ago, the hands she would hold through whatever life brought their way. "Yes," she said simply. "Let's go home." And together they walked into the warm light of the house, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into the future they had fought for, and won not just for themselves, but for all those who needed to believe that even in the harshest landscapes, love and justice could take root and flourish.